Sounds good. Hopefully everyone can see. I'm using it as a my screen right now, just as a cheat sheet of introducing our panelists for this evening or this afternoon's best practice and diversity and inclusion panel. My name's Tony Carizales. I welcome you all to the panel, and I'll be just kind of keeping track of the presentations, introducing the presenters and time, and then we'll be followed up with Professor Daniel Bromberg, who will be our discussant for this evening. I don't have introduction material for each of our presenters, so you're welcome to introduce yourselves if you, to the extent that you are. But with that said, the first presenters, Dr. Patria de Lanza Julnes, will be presenting on best practices adapting award-winning performances, innovation. So Patria, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. You're welcome to share anything that you have, and
Okay.
and take it from there.
Okay, thank you. And then just let me know what you see, because sometimes I don't know exactly what you see. One sec. Share. And 1 second. Did you see the cover?
Yes, it's coming
Okay.
through clearly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm always nervous about these things. So thank you, everybody. Of course, I'm not going to spend time introducing. I'm Patria de Lanza Julnes from Baruch College, Associate Dean and Professor of Public Administration. And the presentation that I have today is based on a book chapter that Mark Holzer and I wrote together. And that is going to be in the newest version of the Public Productivity and Performance Handbook. It has a very practical approach to it. So basically, there are thousands of innovations in public service delivery, and they are recognized annually. These award-winning best practice often address society's most difficult to solve problems and are rich resources for decision-making, seeking examples of policies, programs, and intervention that potentially can be adapted to improve services and outcomes for the public. And what we find, however, is that that they are not very often used by professionals. And so in this presentation, I will talk about the concept of best practices. I will introduce it with a little bit of history and concerns about it and the terms. And I will also suggest a process that we develop for searching cases of best practices. And I will discuss frameworks and guidelines available for decision makers to select the best practices. Now, this is a very short presentation, and so obviously I'm going to suggest that you go to the chapter later on so that you can see the full, so that you can get the full flavor, the full, all the information about this. So it was great. Just earlier today, we had a little presentation about this historical frameworks. And what is really interesting is that for best practices, the quest for best practices has a long legacy, and it is embedded in our orthodox public administration. I don't need to go on it, but you know that it built on efficiency, particularly Woodrow Wilson calling for efficiency in public administration. And this philosophy of efficiency was also compatible with the private sector, particularly with the factory, the US factory, where we had Frederick Taylor on his quest for the one best way to increase productivity. And we can call Frederick Taylor a precursor of practice-based research. And I will come back to that a little bit. And obviously also a precursor for management theory. Working, as we know, at the turn of the century, he was looking for a way the organization could increase productivity by creating the science of work or scientific management that could be applied to routine tasks. This was then followed up by other studies, particularly the Hawthorne electric plant, that, as you know, led to further management behavior, theory of management behavior. Then we also had Herbert Simons, who studied decision-making by observing, again, another precursor of practice-based research by studying the behavior of municipal employees. And more recently, we've also had this push for best practices through the new public management movement in Europe, and of course, the reinventing government movement in the United States. So why should we search for best practices? Best practices of particular interest for professional fields, in fields like us, in public administration, in medicine, business management, education, defense, human services. Professional in these fields benefit from learning about practices that have proven to be effective in addressing the needs of constituencies and stakeholders. Public health practitioners, for example, often seek best practices to avoid wasting resources or reinventing the wheel. So why shouldn't we look for that? By learning from the experiences of others and implementing these interventions and programs that have worked in similar settings, organizations can significantly reduce the costs associated with designing and implementing new initiatives. So needless to say, we believe in best practices, we, meaning myself and Mark Holzer. And so I would like to put forward this particular definition that we have adapted for best practices as being something that is adaptable policies, programs, interventions, or activities that have been developed by similar entities and that have been judged to create public value. And I bring a little bit of Bryson, by citizens and peers, and by peers meaning similar entities, have said that these are best practices. So a human-based, objective-based judgment. How do we select best practices? There are scholars in many different fields, other fields than public administration, have developed frameworks for or suggestions for how we go about in deciding or selecting best practices. We suggest that we could use, for example, Mark Moore's framework, a strategic triangle. Granted, the strategic triangle was not developed for these particular purposes, but it is useful for this. Why? It was developed to guide strategy and action in public organizations. One could argue also that the implementation of a best practice is a strategic action that is intended to help the organization fulfill its mission and achieve its objectives. In that sense, the strategic triangle focuses the attention on pursuing goals and activities that create public value, have support and legitimacy, and which the organization can successfully implement. The other two here on the PowerPoint have been developed. One, the Angoji and Colombani, was in public health, and then Colette is in public policy diffusion. And all of this actually have developed general criteria under different categories that you can use when selecting a best practices for implementation. How do we find best practices? Well, as I mentioned before, they are seemingly an unlimited pool of best practices. And we are particularly focusing on those that are award winners. Why? Because they have been judged to create public value by entities that are similar and by the public. So examples of this are easily found and extend across functions and even international boundaries. There are some that are very well publicized, such as the Harvard Kennedy Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Just as an example, one of their latest award winners, and Elaine is going to be happy to hear this, is the City University of New York Accelerated Study in Associate Programs, which which has created an entire suite of support services for low-income students in community colleges in CUNY to ensure their success. They're one of the winners. They were winners in 2020. We also, most of you are familiar with the Baldrige Performance Excellence, and they also do a variety they also select a variety from award winners from different sectors. For example, one of the award winners was the city of Germantown, Tennessee, the Memorial Hospital and Healthcare Center, and of course, the International City Management Association. But there are others that are more under the radar. And even though we are all members of ASPA, very few of us, probably some of us, but mostly everybody probably here on this around the vessel is familiar with the CAP Organizational Leadership Award. That is an excellent source of innovation. Some of their awardees in the past include King County, the Office of Performance Accountability, City of New Orleans, and the City and County of Denver, and others. Probably few have heard about the Southern Legislative Conference of the Council of State Government State Transformation in Action Recognition. That's another one, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which has a Waste-Wise National Award with many awardees. Our chapter provides an extensive but non-exhaustive list of awards and competition programs throughout the United States in the public sector and also internationally. So you can go there for more examples. So what is a systematic strategy that we are suggesting? First of all, the internet is your friend. The web is your friend when it comes to identifying possibilities. But one should use some of the criteria that from those frameworks that I presented earlier and that are explained in the chapter when selecting these awards. And so we suggest that first you do a search for practice cases over a multi-year period across boundaries and network with a combination of terms that I will share just in a moment. And then that you download and evaluate a manageable set of no more than 10 best practices that promise to serve as adaptable models. And utilizing something like a term such as award winning. Let me show you, because they have been vetted. Why do we focus on award winners? Because these particular cases have already been vetted, as I mentioned, by peers and sometimes also by citizens, and considered to create the public value that we're looking for. So this is a table of possible combinations of terms that could be used. You could also add functions. You could add also years. You can add all kinds of things to this combination and come up with this list of potential best practice cases. Then we suggest that you contact the program directors for this particular best practices. Why? Because as you know, also many times, first of all, you want to confirm that these practices are still in practice, right? That they are still functioning, because many award-winning innovations, they cease to exist because of problems of organizational politics, budget cutbacks, leadership changes at the organizational level. But that doesn't mean that they are not still worthy of learning from. And we suggest a series of questions that could be asked of these different directors. Although best practices are relatively easy to find, there is little evidence that such a search process is widely utilized. In fact, despite the long lineage of best practice that I share, there are also many critics, even though I say, for example, how even we had Taylor, we have Herbert Simons, we have others. They are critics of this type of research, of best practice research. And considerable debate surrounds the selection of best practice, as well as the use of the word best practice, which some describe that the term, some say that the term is overused or misused, and basically just elusive. There's no such thing as a best practice. Also, while the selection of cases of best practice compiled for our chapter for this presentation is based on a selection approach that was best described by Brett Schneider and his colleague as the human judgment. The approach, like, as I mentioned, is criticized by those who advocate for scientifically based research over practice-based research. There are many of those. But overall, best practices are a valuable low investment means of identifying and adapting performance-enhancing innovations. They are relatively easy to find, and despite politicians believe that successful problem solving is just common sense, they really aren't. They are complex solutions to complex problems, and these are complex solutions that are required in order to address our society's most difficult to solve problems. So why on earth would you not utilize a best practice? We think that best practice research can help. Thank you, and I hope I didn't go over.
No, it was perfect timing, and I think we'll have opportunities to ask some questions as after the next presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Evan Berman, who will be talking about generally accepted performance principles. The screen as power is yours now, Evan. We can see you. We see your screen. You're just muted right now.
Very good. How's that?
Mm-hmm.
Good. We can hear you and see this and your screen now. You're all set.
Fantastic. Let's just maximize this. Okay, here we go then. Tony, by the way, I'm notoriously bad for staying on time, so just give me a 3-minute warning.
No problem.
Thank you so much. So I was asked to think a little bit about generally accepted performance principles. Principally, I think because I've lived in many different countries and worked in this area with different countries. By the way, I want to say to Mark, if he's listening, this has been a fantastic day. The group of people brought together, and I've been going back and forth from the academic to the practitioner room. It's just absolutely splendid. This is one of the most energizing events that I've attended in this area in the last a few years, for sure.
Thank you.
So, thanks very, very much. This is incredibly good. And just to let you know, a lot of these PowerPoints from this morning, also from the practitioners, they will make its way into class teaching, right? So this stuff is definitely used. So anyway, so I'll talk a little bit about the idea of performance standards and so on. For those of you who don't know me, since there were no introductions, this is very, very brief, a little bit about me. The point is that I'm now currently in Brazil, working at Brazil's top private university in São Paulo. If you don't know Brazil or South America, about half of Brazil's GDP is produced in São Paulo, and about a quarter of all GDP in South America is produced in São Paulo. And this is a major interface with the government in Brazil as well. I grew up abroad in Holland and I grew up there, went to master's there, and know those countries pretty well. I did a career in the US. For the last 15 years, I've divided between East Asia through Taiwan, in the last 6 years in New Zealand, focusing on Southeast Asia. And so the area that I do, as you can see, is in public performance. So all of this is very dear to me. And the reason I went into public administration to begin with is to work with practitioners. So this whole idea of promoting generally accepted performance practices is really dear to me, and I think this is just fantastic. So I'll structure my talk in a few main points. This is just by way of introduction, like what are generally accepted performance or accounting principles, like so. The idea of generally accepted performance principles, obviously based on GAAP in accounting. And I think for people who are, by the way, this is the 4th time in my career that I'm in a business school. So I'm pretty close to business school and accounting courses and that kind of stuff. And so on the accounting side, there are 3 things to know about GAAP. One is about broad principles. They have like 12 broad principles, and some of them are listed there. But these broad principles have very clear purposes. If it were broad principles that have broad purposes, they might not have any impact. The purposes are very specific to help and improve decision-making, performance, record keeping, and like so, all of which can be measured. And the standards are very detailed, very, very detailed. I forget how many hundreds of standards there are, but that is why there are accounting programs and accounting masters and like so. So that's really important to know. So it is broad principle, but everything else gets very clear and very practical, and that makes it adoptable and effective. On the academic side, many of us are familiar with NASPA. Again, I'm also in business school, so I'm also very familiar with AACSB, but all these accreditation programs, they have converged, just like accounting principles or performance principles are converging, is also converging. And I really like NASPA, the idea behind it. I really do. It's a clear purpose. It's about quality benchmarks. It's not about best practices, by the way. Accreditation is, or accepted principle is not about best practices. They're about effective practices, minimally effective practices that are useful. They provide general standards. They're pretty general, and they have a peer review assessment mechanism. And I'll get to that later, because for principles to have bite, they need to be implemented in some manner. And so that is what you see in both the accounting side and in educational accreditation, that there is real bite there. There is an enforcement standard setting there, not just the idea, there's some practice there too. So today I want to talk about 7 things. If you're going to develop generally accepted performance principles, here are 7 things that I suggest based on my experience in different areas, things that you would have to deal with. You'd have to ask, what is the purpose of these principles? For whom are these principles? What usefulness are these principles? Who would provide the principles and who would assess that the principles are being applied? Then what principles, what standards, and what guidance and examples are given? Now, if you really want to be an academic, you can also go to the right side of the screen and ask, let's have a philosophical question about what criteria or considerations should be underlying these. Let's not forget social justice and equity and all those things you can add to that, get very complicated. But at the end of the day, I think those 7 things on the left side is where the action is, and they need to be specific. And if this is not about decision making by committee, if this is going to have legs, it needs to have effect in the real world, and all those things need to have really clear answers. So the first main part of my presentation is to give you some points that come from my observation, and then I'll get to more detailed things actually. But this is just to summarize as quick as I can in a limited time. The first thing is that performance standards are not best practices. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about good, desirable, effective practices. It's a floor, the minimum floor of what we would think is good, desirable, or effective. If you want to get into best practices, then give additional best practice awards for superior achievement, maybe those who achieve accreditation or use of general accepted performance principle at the highest possible level. But it's about good, desirable, effective performance practices. That's what we're trying to do. Set a standard there, a minimum standard there. Secondly, we know, such as in academia, but also if you listen to this morning, that different countries, different jurisdictions are different places in their evolution, path dependency, I don't know, but in their evolution or use of performance management. And so the question is, gee, well, how can you set standards that are good, desirable, effective, that would have bite and relevance for countries, jurisdictions at very, very different levels? And the answer comes from looking, for example, at NASPA and accreditation in general, that you require a continuous improvement element. That is really key to make these things work. There has to be continuous, so whatever level you're at, the standard has to include some continuous improvement and some enforcement or bite into that. That has been so key. I worked in Indonesia. I know the Vietnamese. I know Malaysia. I talked to people in Singapore. I lived in New Zealand. Continuous improvement lies at the heart of it, which also speaks to performance culture. So if you listen to this morning, what I picked up, the areas of continuous improvement for even those that are among the best in class today, they still need to sometimes improve incentive systems. There are a lot of questions around that this morning. Whole of government, connecting with citizen and development experiences. You may have great systems, but if the country is still not developing well, something still needs to be improved. And it'll be a continuous journey. That's why it's not best practice. It is good, desirable, effective. Okay, finally, it needs to be tailorable to specific uses and contexts and like so. Each jurisdiction must, and that's what you also, again, if you're an academic, you look at NASPA and accreditation, you see there are general standards and people are required, the jurisdiction or in this case, the educational program is required to translate that into their context through a mission statement and show that the mission statement has real specificity in their context and like so. So these are some points I put. Here's some more points. And I covered this especially from Indonesia and places with a more legal culture than the Anglo culture. The Commonwealth is great, but in other countries who come from like a French, Napoleon, Italian, Portuguese legal system, which is a lot of the rest of the world, you see the need for an authoritative body that must implement this in some way. And so the question is, and this I don't have an answer for, but there needs to be some influential partner in each country that would actually enforce or advocate or develop it, and what cannot possibly be an academic organization, because that has no teeth whatsoever with most professional or most government bodies in most countries that I know. So this is a question I don't know. It has to be a global learning journey. There's so many great examples from around the world, outside the Commonwealth too, like in Indonesia. They have such fantastic things on the intergovernmental promotion of performance management. Unbelievable, setting standards for local government that they must practice. People don't know because they're not part of the Commonwealth or other things. So we also need research into these other places as well. About making the standards, I think broad-based input is good, but decision making by committees absolutely not. So how can we develop excellent standards? That becomes, I think, a very important question. And finally, the guidance and implementation should be detailed and helpful. And then the question is that then becomes a live thing. So if you want to really promote this, you think about websites, but also people who can reach out to cities or states or provinces that want to improve, and that has to be a living thing. It can't die. So Mark, talk about sustainability. I would think an effort of general accepted performance principles must be thinking about sustainability in the area of continuous excellence and global learning journey, right? That'd be institutionalized in that way. Now, let me work on these 7 points that I just mentioned a little bit. For what purpose? Well, that's self-evident, to further public performance. Although in some countries, that's not necessarily that evident, by the way. So this can be a issue in some countries that I'm thinking about, like so. For whom? That's an important one. By the way, the purpose of for whom is also like the advancement of modern objectives, and like how do you know that you're actually achieving that, right? So it's not just a mission statement, right? That'll obviously, the whole getting data will also apply to making generally accepted performance principles work itself, right? Okay, good. For whom? That's a good thing. For me, I would say principally program managers, and then you work out from there. But it's very key to have your clients in mind. This is not an abstract kind of thing. At the national government, I'm working in national government too in Brasilia and Jakarta, but I also work with provinces and cities. So it looks really different at subnational government. And somehow you've got to work for it for all those different levels. Usefulness, I mean, that's why the gap standards and accountability in accounting are so powerful, because they have clear usefulness. And that has actually been a little bit of a problem, I think, for the performance movement, up until recently anyway, to show that it actually has effect. The studies, for example, in the use of performance information budgeting show that they don't have much effect. Well, that's not very useful. So we have to come up with practices that show how this is useful. I think we're only just getting there now. Who provides and assesses? Well, that is a key thing. And so that we probably just need more discussion about. I'm really interested about the view of the Commonwealth on that. I think there's something there. I just wanted to make a little digression to research, since this is the academic panel. I just want to make a suggestion that we meet in our research, which I spelled wrong, I see here. We need to move, I think, from global or from general global explanations, as we heard some on the academic side. Some excellent, brilliant presentations here, but also very general explanations, at a very high level, that may not be very useful for practitioners and hence for the development of GAP. And I think we need to move to some mid-range theory that really advances the enterprise that we want to embark in. This is from a recent article that I got published in PPMR. Thank you, Mark, for your leadership there. This should be the academic journal of choice for general accepted performance principles. And in this work, I was able to work with the Indonesian Ministry of Administrative Reforms, with the Vice Minister of Administrative Reform for the Republic of Indonesia. And they developed a program that's now been running for about 7 years to promote performance management use by medium to large cities in Indonesia. They have an outreach program, and it's a very comprehensive, very well thought thing. They have four tenets, if you will, for activities through which they promote that at a local level. One of it is to create support from the mayor for this. Another one is some training. But a very interesting avenue is they do annual appraisal, like an accreditation investigation, right? Annual performance accountability of all of these cities, and they get a score from A through D. And they started out with a letter C. Now, this is very courageous of the national government giving mayors a score of a C. But they did that, and slowly over time, through objective accounting, they're slowly being raised. And in the research that I did, this is for the academics, on the yellow arrow, it showed very clear evidence that the annual audit, is called a SACIP audit there, like performance management audit, is associated with city leader support. Now, city leader support means both the mayor and like the director general or city manager of that city. These scores are published, they are in the newspaper, the governor announces it. If it's good, you get an award as a mayor. If it's bad, you're also held out. It could have political implications in some campaigns because your opponents can run with this. It works. The auditing of performance management at cities is effective. Secondly, in terms of incentives that we heard a lot spoken about, the program directors in the cities, their performance bonus is tied now to how well they implement performance management. And that incentive is strongly linked to their use of that performance information for decision making, which in turn is linked to the effectiveness and impact on their SACIP audit score for how well they use performance management the year after. So as academics, we can actually investigate this and provide evidence about what works, right? Like the Secretary General was saying, we need to work on what works. So maybe academics can do research into what works, and we can do this and like so. So I just wanted, this is just academic side thing now. Just to continue, so if you ask me my principles, and Mark, this was a little bit off the top of my head, but I think it is more or less on target. I would say performance, I use a different slide here. I had the language a little bit better, but it's like furthering the development of society, something about excellence, something about integrity, something about being inclusive or social justice, and something about communication. So I think that these are the principles that I would probably put out there that could probably find enough support to talk about. Oh, here it is. Sorry. So this is the slide that it should have been. So benefit society, furthers this, and so on. In terms of standards, I think it's something like this. Again, you should not have too many standards, or it's not useful, but you can have many substandards. Something, obviously, you plan and manage with results in mind. That may sound obvious, but if you think about standard setting and having to assess who doesn't meet, then this would be the very basic and important standard for meeting minimum good and effective practices, like so. Performance is recognized. I think that is probably an important standard. Otherwise, why do it? It has legal and other foundations, which I'll talk about in a second. It creates and strengthens cultures of performance, and it disseminates and communicates performance information. I would put these as a standard for any accreditation that would be accompanied by, with a generally accepted performance principles. Like, these are the standards that an organization would have to meet. I mean, I'm just offering this here as a platform for discussion, and others such as Professor Trivedi and others, you'll get a lot of input, but it has to be something that could work. Now, within each of those, you can have your substandards, right? This is just from the presentation an hour ago on Barbados. It sort of brings together under point 3, what are the other foundations that we now, at this point in time, know that are important. Some of these are, I think this slide sort of captures the kind of things practices that you would expect to find in a jurisdiction that meets GAP.
Three minutes, Evan.
Yeah, okay, I'm almost done. So then, in terms of guidance and principles, I think, sub-standards and detailed guidance for each. I don't think it's very difficult. I think we need to provide examples of practices where there is possible confusion or issues that are contentious. You have to clarify carefully what would not meet the standard. Examples of innovative and superior applications are good. That's not necessary for meeting the standard, but this would be very useful. All of whatever you do, it needs to be updated on a regular basis. So you need a process that every 2 or 3 years people meet and approve it. And then there's a key question always: do you want to certify advisors or consultants on the standards that are being put forward? You don't want just anybody going there, holding themselves out as being an expert when they are absolutely not. On the other hand, you're not here to promote money-making objectives either. So somehow balancing those two would seem necessary. So in conclusion, could we create gap? Oh, absolutely. Technically, absolutely. I'm a big fan of it, and I'd like to work with anybody who wants to put this forward in a very serious way. Absolutely. I think you want to have not too many principles and standards. They got to be uplifting, inspiring, but also practical. We need an excellence-based decision-making process for the adoption of what GAP might be. I'm not sure about who the best or influential partners are for each country, or how that could be assessed. That's a tough one in my mind. And then coming full cycle, then what results for this GAP effort do the GAP leaders have in mind for GAP over the next 3, 5, or 7 years? So if you adopt a GAP, what results would you expect, would you hope to find GAP to have in 3, 5, and 7 years? I think that would also drive the effort and mobilize the effort of people on GAP. So that is my story. Thank you so much. Hope this helps.
Thank you very much. Our third presenter, Dr. Kevin Broner, you have now control of the screen if you want to share your talk on promoting sexual equity in police departments by using strategic planning.
Kevin, you're muted.
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
You're all good. We can see and hear you. You're all set.
Okay, great. I'll start this off. I'm Kevin Broner. I'm with the Nelson A. Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy in Albany, New York. Now, this project started, I was teaching a class in financial management, and we were having a little component about internal control. And one of the things that came up was this article by Walker, Munster, and Joost about strategic planning. It was in Public Administration Review. So the article concluded that the use of strategic planning improves organizational performance. And they went through a methodology in the paper that they took data for private and public organizations from a bunch of journal articles. And they came up with the conclusion that strategic planning is useful. At the same time that I was reviewing that information, as part of that course I was teaching at the Rockefeller College, I had the students read a document from the Office of the New York State Controller. It's called Standards for Internal Control in New York State Government. And the New York State Controller, they believe that strategic planning is an important part of internal control. And they say the use of goals and objectives using measurable targets are useful to management in state government. I just want to emphasize, this is for state government, so different New York State departments. So with that information in hand, I said to myself, well, do larger local governments in New York State, I'm talking about counties, cities, and towns mostly, do they use strategic planning? And I started a pilot study in December of 2019, and I picked the local area of Albany, New York. And this was designed to be a pilot study. Just to say, the only question in this was, do you have a strategic plan? And please let me see it if you have it. So 12 governments were included in the study, and they had total revenues of about $2.3 billion. I'm just going to go through a list of the counties. There were 4 large counties with fairly significant budgets. There were 4 cities, they're listed there. And then I did town government, some of the larger towns. This colony, that's the one I live in, and that's really going to become the subject of this paper, which we'll see in a couple of minutes. So the way this was done, I issued a written freedom of information requests were sent to the governments, and the responses were received by mid-January. And it worked out pretty well. The only problem was the pandemic hit, and I haven't really picked up on the study because a lot of the governments are still closed down. So eventually I'll pick up and extend this to the rest of the state. But for now, I just wanted to sample in on or just talk a little bit about the pilot study. So 2 of the governments, Albany County and the town of Colony, claimed to use strategic planning. Now, if you look at Albany County, they had a strategic plan for the county Department of Health. The rest of the Albany County departments had no strategic plan. And the town of Colony government it was really a financial plan. It wasn't a strategic plan. So the bottom line of this, the pilot study showed that of the 12 governments, only 1 used strategic planning, and it was limited to the health department. So this gets us into the key part of my paper now. There's a local government police reform effort in New York State. What happened was the governor issued an executive order that requires police departments to develop reform plans by April 2021. So they've been filed very recently. A lot of them aren't out public yet, but they have been filed. And the hypothesis I'm going on is that I think strategic planning with survey research is useful for this reform effort. So what I did, I filed comments in the town I live in, the town of Colony, New York. And I filed those on February 4th. And I asked to have the police department develop a strategic plan with some goals and objectives to study social justice issues. And I really wanted to have survey research used on this, on social justice issues as they relate to the police department. Now, one of the cities that I studied in the strategic planning effort did have a survey. They conducted a survey in March 2021. So they seem to be headed in the right direction. And just a little bit more on this government finance review, recent issue in February 2021 said that police budgets have to build trust and open communication. They need more public engagement and treating everyone fairly. I think we all agree to that. So if we look at the reform effort in New York State, there was a document that some of the police departments used. And it was a reinvention collaborative resources guide for public officials and citizens. And in this, it said on page 71 that police departments should conduct an annual survey to measure the level of trust in the community. And the survey should be taken by zip codes. And it talked about, this report was from August 2020. So basically my thought here is I really think that police departments should use strategic planning and that they should have a survey in this. And I even want the town of Colony, which is the one I live in with about $100 million budget, I want them to place this survey on the town board either yearly or every 2 years. So if there's a budget constraint, I could have it every 2 years. And I like it to go to the top of the town of Colony government, and I want them to vote on it. So I don't know what the survey would show, but if it shows there's a lot of distrust of the police department, I think the officials at the top of the organization should know that, and they should vote on it to see if they think the survey was correct. Now, there is some survey information about the Colony Police Department. It has like a 92% approval rating. And one thing about it is it doesn't seem, the Colony Police Department doesn't seem to have these big events going on where people are arrested and eventually killed somehow. So these real bad news events like the George Floyd event. So there isn't anything like that so far here. But I just think strategic planning with a nice piece of survey research focused on social justice would be a nice element to have in our police reform effort. So it's a pretty simple message I have here, and I'm trying to do this in a real environment here. I've done it for the town of Colony, and I've offered the proposal. Whether or not they'll accept it, I don't know what's going to happen yet. So that's really all I have to present today.
Thank you very much. And to all the panelists as well. I'm now like to introduce Dr. Daniel Brumberg, who will be our panel discussant for the remainder of the panel. Also, if you have any questions or formulating some thoughts, you can utilize the chat. And Dan, I think you're now up.
Great. I feel like this is kind of like an improv act. You get what people throw at you, and you gotta put it together. So thank you to the presenters. Really appreciate what you all put out there. Really interesting stuff. And what strikes me is we've been having these conversations for quite some time. And listening to both Evan and Patria around the usefulness of performance and how do we get managers to of performance data, I should say. How do we get managers to engage in this process? And for whom is that, process most useful? And I look to what Evan said, and as far as this foundation of this needs to be useful for managers themselves, right? If this isn't useful for those managers, then the rest of it, truthfully, doesn't matter. The challenge that we have, though, is that managers aren't necessarily the only ones who are always making these decisions, right? There are any number of stakeholders that are engaged in these processes that potentially could turn any of this on its head. And then all of a sudden, the indicators that those managers thought were useful are not actually what they're left measuring. And this is one of those challenges that I think occurs on a regular basis. So just kind of thinking about this holistically across the three presentations, I think about the generally accepted performance principles to some degree as a foundation, right? As what Evan had mentioned, right? This is your floor. This is your foundation that you need to build upon. It demonstrates effectiveness, and you need that effectiveness before you can do anything else, right? And then we could look at what Patria and Kevin are presenting as add-ons. As okay, now we have this down, right? We have our foundation down. We know what is effective. Now, how do we strive for some of these best practices? What's shocking, though, is how few cities and organizations, I mean, in Kevin's case, looking at strategic planning or even doing a strategic planning process. So it's concerning, I think, to think that cities and organizations aren't moving in that direction. And I think there's some evidence that shows, over time, performance data, if it's mandated and it's not useful for the managers, is not going to be used, right? And myself and Etienne Charbonneau conducted a few studies looking at the Ontario system, where they, 400 plus municipalities are using performance data, and they're actually not digging into that data and actually making it useful for themselves. So I think that is one of those main questions, right? The for whom. The other thing that comes up when thinking about all of these is capacity. What organizations have the capacity to take on, whether they're mandates or they're self-initiated programs, and how does capacity come into play? In Patria's case, in those best practices that you're describing, the first thing that comes to mind for me is what's the relationship between university systems and some of these local governments, right? Some of these, the inquiries that you're describing with looking into best practices, contacting these managers, right? These are time-consuming processes to learn, and we have students that are doing this. A lot of this is based on who's investing in these processes. Evan, you gave a couple examples of cities, countries potentially, right, that are investing in these processes. That enables these cities and these larger units of government to actually go ahead and do this. And that's a political question, right? Who is going to invest in that and say, yes, we are going to promote this to a higher level? So those are really just a few of my thoughts. I'd love to open it up to other questions. And I guess I want to start with Patria. I'll just throw a question out to you. You started with the idea that award-winning practices actually aren't being used that much. That these things are actually relatively easy to find. They're out there on the web, but they're not being used. And Evan kind of brought up this idea of usefulness and how these could all be helpful for these cities. And same with Kevin with the strategic planning process. Why is it, do you think, that they're not being picked up and they're not being used by these organizations?
Mm-hmm. Well, now you're asking an empirical question.
This is the academic panel.
That's right. Well, actually, there is a lot of research on this idea of best practice, but I think that a lot of us, and I was listening to Evan and how he kept saying, we're talking about effective practice, not best practice, and then I just kept thinking, okay, so you are one of these skeptics, but I wasn't saying that, but I was thinking, but what I'm saying is that, no, I know you're not. No, but there's a lot of research really that basically criticizing the idea of best practice. And we've had this debate for a long time that no, the term shouldn't be used, that there's no such thing as best practice, that they are very context bound. And while it is true that a lot of it are context bound, there are frameworks out there, and that's something like what we try to put in the chapter to help you actually analyze these practices that are out there and make that decision of deciding whether or not you can actually adapt it. But I think that there is a best practice has earned that, even the term, it just has earned a very negative connotation. The first thing is like, well, it's not best. But in our mind, if you're creating public value, it is new to you, and this is how you're going to best what you're doing, okay, then it is a best practice. It has been so defined by whether it is because it is more effective. Well, it is best in what you have. So I think that in many ways, again, there is a hesitancy. It's come down to even what the term means. I mean, there's whole papers, as we were looking at this for writing the chapter, there are whole papers about this, about why we shouldn't use the term best practice. And I think that has a lot to do with that. I like a lot your suggestions, and if I may just say that, about universities. We have students who can do this kind of research. Yes, it is. That's the other thing you mentioned. Well, it is time consuming. Well, yeah, anything that's worth looking for, it is time consuming. And so, but I think you have a great point in terms of that. Why don't we have projects, our master's programs, for example, and try to come up with these exemplars, of practice that can be shared with local government for issues, to try to solve the local problems, because the reality is that a lot of things have been tackled, and a lot of the problems tend to be recurrent problems magnified. Some of them now are magnified, but a lot of them are recurrent problem. And so if there is something that is out there that has proven in some context to be useful, why not go after it using a system, a framework to determine if it will be useful to you? So to me, it's both. There is a scholarly issue, for that we have ourselves created. There are those who feel that using awards as a foundation for data is not appropriate, which I think, then how do you know if you don't go after this data that are available and you haven't used it? And so we have a lot to contribute. And like you were saying, time consuming. And I think that working with universities is a great idea. Working with MPA undergraduate programs, just looking at local solutions. And that's one project that could be done to help this process.
Thank you. I think that's great. And kind of thinking about what I heard Evan said was not that, there's a distinction, right, between effectiveness, and Evan, please, jump in, right? There's a distinction between effectiveness and best practices. They shouldn't necessarily compete with each other, but you need effectiveness prior to going out for that best practice. What I wanted to hit on for Kevin and Evan was, Evan, you had mentioned this idea of an authoritative body jumping in. And I don't know if you were suggesting that it needs to be mandated that these principles be taken up. And in Kevin, in your presentation, you had mentioned that this actually was this is going to be mandated, a mandated reform. So Evan, and then maybe Kevin, I'm wondering how you guys think that comes into play as far as instilling these practices in organizations.
Well, the nice thing we're going to have in New York is we're going to have these reform programs from all these different police departments. And once they become public, we can start to examine them to see if there is some consensus on what certain best practices are. So it's pretty interesting. I don't pretend to be a police department expert or anything. I'm more, strategic planning, I'm an expert, and I think it's helpful to them. But I would think that people that are interested in criminal justice would tear apart those reform programs that are going to be offered in New York State. They have been offered. They came out last Friday, some of them are a little late, but I would think there's a great body of knowledge there for police and criminal justice experts to look into and determine what the best practices are.
Hey, could I tell Kevin, I found I'm sorry, if I could just an example that there are actually some awards that in some of those less known awards that are tackling this issue have been tackling them, but they are not shared. So we don't know.
I think two responses from me. In putting this PowerPoint slide together, this morning prompted a few things in my mind. The authoritative body, yes, there's no doubt about that, and academia is not the place to be. But once you have legal foundation that allows for this, and again, not every country is a case law country like the Commonwealth or America, right? So some are really legally driven, right? And much of the world is in fact that way. So once you have laws and regulations that allow it, require it, it's only a little step further to then assess whether people are doing it at an appropriate level, and that is where these GAP principles could be extremely useful. So I think that then actually becomes the authoritative body, and you can imagine America doesn't have that system, but other countries do, including the Commonwealth, where you have a system of central ministries or core ministries, like a Treasury Department or like so. Where you could have a unit that is in fact assessing other departments and sub-national governments in the unitary system. That's not the American system, but other countries have a more unitary system, whether or not sub-national governments are implementing it. So actually, it may not be so difficult as I presented it. The second comment I want to make is to Patria in defense of best practices, if I may. A comment in defense. I'm not quite sure what the empirical research is to say that best practices are not being used. I'm not convinced of that there is all that much, or that it is asking the right question. And what is it that you would expect best practices to achieve, or how would you know whether or not best practices are adopted or not? if you think about the use of it, so when you talk to practitioners, they absolutely appreciate best practices because that inspire. But then people say, well, how can I adopt it to mine? By the time you adopt somebody else's to your own, then it's no longer the best practice. It should not be the best practice, somebody else's best practice. You need your practice, right? Like so. And so if you have a best practice that is only adopted by, say, 5 other jurisdictions, does that mean that it's not widely adopted, that it has not been effective? Maybe it has been hugely effective. So I think we need to think about how practitioners actually use best practices before we say that they are not effective. Then I do agree with Patria that you have an academic industry that gets published by that has published in the past. Today, it would no longer be cutting edge, so you wouldn't get published, but has published by criticizing the idea of best practices. I agree, but that is philosophical. That's not empirical based. That's not based on empirical research with jurisdictions and practitioners, whether they actually agree with those criticisms that academics have leveled and got published. So I would just want to say some words in defense of best practice. Now, the reason in my presentation that I drew a distinction because of the GAP endeavor, the enterprise of GAP is not about best practices. That's not to put best practices down. And in fact, there is a place for best practices in GAP. But setting general agreed performance practices is not about is fundamentally not about best practices. So that's a distinction I was making. And actually, I would speak in defense of best practices. And I would disagree with my colleagues. Almost every important trend in the world. By the way, another person, let me just back off. Almost every important academic trend that has existed begun with academic criticizing about it. New public management, total quality management, privatization, the list is endless. And it gets adopted throughout the world, and over time, the academic critiques fades. That's number one. So the fact that there are voices or reasonable opinions against it doesn't mean that they will hold the day, that they will have long legs. Second point, in terms of a person that presented today that would definitely disagree that best practices are not important would be the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. I'm quite sure that she would be delighted to see best practices in the area of performance management because they could be used in training and for stimulating other countries to move towards that direction. So enough words spoken in defense of best practices. Okay, Patria?
I love it. Thank you so much for defending it and for expanding. And I really like particularly your comment about, it's just how it evolves. Your question is that, well, then once it's adapted, then it is not that best practice. Now it is your best practice. So that's
right.
And that is, you're absolutely right. It's like, how do we empirically assess that? Because it has already evolved.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Excellent points. Thank you.
Yeah. And then maybe Dan, throw it open to the audience too, right? I just want to say one of my professors a long time ago was Amitai Etzioni of Washington, D.C., a sociologist. And he gave me an assignment. I honestly forget what the assignment was. I cannot for the life of me remember, but I tried to be probably too excellent or too perfect, right? And he told me, Evan, you're doing okay, but remember, your job is to make the world better. Leave it to the next generation to make it perfect, okay? We just need to make it a little bit better, okay? So if best practices serve not to make the best possible world, but to make the world better, then I think best practices are achieving an important aim.
Yeah. And we have a lot of smart people around here, and I'm sure they will continue this conversation and the research. New generation.
I testified before the Governmental Accounting Standards Board yesterday on a big model they have to change the way accounting statements are set up. And listening to this discussion today, I don't see why you couldn't have a similar organization. We're talking really about regulating governments so they have best practices. So if the Governmental Accounting Standards Board can be set up and they go through I think it's a pretty good process to determine the standards. I don't see why people that are interested in government planning and productivity couldn't have a similar organization.
I agree. Dan, do you want to throw the floor open, please?
Yeah,
it shouldn't just be a conversation among us, please.
I'll open it up. Blue, it looks like you had a question, and
thanks,
Patria, it looks like you need to take off. So thank you so much for presenting. I don't know that my role extends this far, but I'm happy to open it up a little bit. Go ahead, Blue.
Okay, thanks, Dan. A great presentation. For Patriots, of course, but the rest of them were great. A couple of things. Evan, when you were talking about who would have this responsibility, I was at the 1973 ICMA conference when GAO presented the Yellow Book to the city managers. And I've been following the Yellow Book and GAO and Supreme Audit institutions. I've done some international work myself in different countries. And I think that if we could convince these equivalent of GAOs in other countries, the Supreme Audit Institutes, many of which have adopted performance auditing, economy and efficiency auditing, in addition to financial auditing, I'm trying right now to try to integrate, going back to Kevin's point, I developed a model of strategic planning that I've used for the last 40 years. And I'm trying to now integrate social equity because of the National Academy saying that equity is the fourth pillar of public administration, along with economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And I'm trying to integrate social equity into strategic planning. So first of all, I commend Kevin trying to do some work about the police departments and strategic planning, particularly if there's an equity dimension in it. And then secondly, if we could get, now, by the way, the Yellow Book used to have, as part of their auditing standards, equity in it. And recently, when they redid the Yellow Book, they took out that phrase. And those of us on the standing panel on social equity at the Academy have been pushing GAO to try to get that one simple sentence back into the Yellow Book. So I think that's also another way of particularly integrating social equity into performance measurement and performance auditing and generally accepted performance principles. Thanks.
Remember, in New York State, in my presentation, I went through it kind of quickly. The Office of the State Controller's Internal Control Manual calls for strategic planning for all the state agencies. So to some extent, this is already being done in New York State.
Dan,
Can I make a comment? Or?
So go ahead, Mark.
The Gatsby mention is interesting, but so decades ago, must have been 25 years, I don't know. So there was this, an effort to establish service efforts and accomplishment reporting.
Right.
In conjunction with Gatsby, and the financial people just buried it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it, in a sense. So I want to stay away from the financial types who just see tend to see the world through their own lenses and and narrowly. Trouble is there isn't now a parallel organization that could do this, but it may be that along the lines of the criteria that Evan was outlining, that there's going to be a need for some organization like that, or maybe it's the Commonwealth, where I think you might get more consensus on it than establish a standard and coming back to the U.S. just try to embarrass the U.S. into doing it, from the outside.
I wasn't thinking of having Gatsby do it. I was just using it as an example of an organization that maybe we could develop.
Well, I mean, Gatsby is a pretty complex organization and well-funded. So I don't know if we have the short-term wherewithal in the public sector to do that, in a sense. But I always thought that embarrassment is a pretty good point of leverage. If you could just establish it in 54 countries around the world.
Yeah.
And it showed actual progress and savings and was politically viable, et cetera, et cetera, then it more likely would come back to the US.
Probably. Let me just say, Mark, that the Commonwealth could advise governments on certain standards, and that would be leverage. And then, having lived in New Zealand, I can promise you that if the Commonwealth can convince the UK or at least England to adopt those standards, then it'll spread like a wildfire throughout the rest of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, exactly.
It won't touch America. So America has its own little arrangements in that regard, right?
Yeah.
And likewise, if UNDP were to adopt certain standards, some countries would that would have leverage, but it would not influence what happens in the US.
The other thing I thought when the Gatsby SEC period did not have, but we now have, is the Chief Performance Officer. So I'm not sure, I'm thinking about whether or not that's a one channel that we can push GAP, at least the idea of GAP through. So just one option's out there.
Well, I mean, that's if the performance
administration
see anything other than measurement as their bailiwick. I mean, I think they might be interested in measurement. They're interested in technological innovation, but I'm not sure they're interested in the other dimensions of performance. But it's a good idea. It's an idea worth pursuing.
I do think that with the Biden administration, and particularly Susan Rice and the Domestic Council, emphasizing that equity is going to be one of the criteria to evaluate all federal programs, we could then again put more pressure on GAO to restore equity as being one of the types of assessment that's in the Yellow Book. And then through INTOSI, which is, of course, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, which, as far as I know, the Secretariat is at GAO, we might be able to spread the word that way.
We've reached the end of the time session, and I want to make sure that we give everybody that break that they need before their next panels. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank our three panelists, our discussant, and everyone that joined in for this panel this afternoon. Thank you all very much, and have a great conference, continuing with the conference.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony. Elaine.
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Oh, okay, great. Well, take a break.